everyone, here's how I put together the non-smock version of Children's Corner Lee pattern. It's rather simple and lends many different embellishment options, and as always, the timestamps as well as a huge list of materials and supplies can be found in the description box below. So to get started, I cut a bias band that's 2 inches wide and 20 inches long, and this is going to be used on the bottom edge of the sleeves. Then I have 4 collar pieces, 2 yoke front pieces, 1 for the dress and 1 for the lining, and 2 yoke back pieces, again 1 for the dress and 1 for the lining. Also, I constructed my dress a little bit differently than the pattern calls for, so I cut my yoke back on the fold using the lap line. I don't cut along the facing line. So then I have 2 sleeves and then 2 rectangles for the skirt, 1 for the skirt front and the other for the skirt back, and both skirt pieces will get this little armhole template cut out of them. So to begin, I cut some piping to use for the collar. I'm cutting it down to 1/4 inch wide since that's the seam allowance around the collar for an embellishment. Of course, you could do ribbon, trim, or some other lace instead, whatever floats your boat. It is sewing, you do you. So then I attach the piping to the collar and I'm stitching right on top of the stitches already on the piping. And then I'm matching up the collar with its lining and sewing the 2 pieces together with right sides together. And I'm putting the collar with the piping attached to it on top so I can see where my previous stitches are. And the goal here is to sew right inside of those previous stitches so you have a clean, neat collar. And then I turned the collar right sides out and gave it an ironing. So next I moved on to the yoke pieces. I'm attaching them together at the shoulder seams in an alternating manner of 1 yoke front and then a yoke back, and then the other yoke front and then the other yoke back. And I'm also using 1/2 inch seam allowances for better security. The pattern calls for 1/4 inch and it's not that big of a difference sizing wise, but it does give you a little bit more meat there so you have more security when your little toddler tugs and pulls on this dress. So then you can iron the shoulder seams open and then fold along those back pieces. This will consequently have the yoke front touching the yoke front lining. Hope that's all making sense how this is going to close together. And it's a really helpful tip to put a little tack connecting the collars at the seam allowance. So 1/4 inch in this case. So basically at the 1/4 inch mark, I'm making sure those collars are right next to each other and putting in a little open zigzag. You want the zigzag stitches to be easily removed with your seam rippers, but this step ensures that you aren't going to have a little unsightly gap between your collars. So then I took my yoke front and folded it over, matching up the shoulder seams, and then I gave that an ironing, and this is just a fast way to mark the center front. And now I can use that crease to line up my collar's center front with the yoke's center front. You see where I'm going here? And then I continue to pin the collar around in place from there. And I go around the collar just basting it in place, and then I fold the lining right sides together to the yoke front and back pieces, so the bodice pieces down. And I give that a quick ironing so it lays nicely when I take it to my machine and sew it from one back of the neckline to the other back. Then I trim around the corners so it's easier to make a nice point. I also clip around the curves so the neckline will lay nice and flat. And finally, I use this little tool to push out the corners so they make a pretty point, and the tool is linked below. After I gave the neckline a really good ironing, then I took out those zigzag stitches at the collar. Okay, so moving on to the skirt, I put 2 rows of gather stitches at the top of the skirt. And the reason for 2 rows of gather stitches is that 1 row will go on either side of where your permanent stitches will go later on, and having 2 rows will keep those gathers straight as you sew over them so they're not going to go all crooked, wishy-washy on you. And then I decided to put in some piping between the yoke and the skirt. So I'm measuring out a piece of piping for the front of the dress and then adjusting the skirt front until it matches the length of the piping, making sure that those gathers are evenly adjusted. After sewing the piping to the skirt front, then I put the yoke front right sides together with the skirt front so I can sew the 2 together. And I sew them together with the skirt facing up so I can see the previous stitches attaching that piping. The goal is to sew just inside of those previous stitches so you have a nice clean transition. So eventually the yoke lining will be folded under and hand sewn using those machine stitches to hide those raw edges. But if you've seen my videos before, then you know that I like to save all of my hand sewing until the very end in whenever possible. So for now, I'm just going to repeat the same process to the skirt back. The skirt back is a little bit different though, since it's going to get a placket. And to find the center of the skirt back, I just fold it in half and give it an ironing. And I use that crease and I just call it close enough. This is not rocket science, people, so it doesn't need to be that exact. And I cut along that crease for about 4 inches and install the placket, and I have a detailed video on how to sew a placket that I've linked below. So since this is a girl's outfit, the right side of the placket will close over the left side. And that's why you see me folding the right side of the placket under before matching it up with the back of the yoke. And I line up the back yoke at the crease with the placket edge. And then I sew the two together with right sides together. And I repeat the same thing to the left side of the dress, except this time the placket doesn't get folded under. And so once both sides of the skirt are attached, then I iron under the lining raw edges. Remember, these will get hand sewn using those machine stitches later on. So for now, I'm just going to baste the folded edges to the dress so they don't unfold accidentally. So moving on to the sleeves, I put 2 rows of gather stitches in both the top of the sleeve as well as the bottom of the sleeve. And I gather the bottom of the sleeve until it fits the bias band length required for your little one. And I take the bias band and fold it in half lengthwise. After matching up the raw edges and adjusting the gathers evenly, I sew the bias band to the bottom edge of the sleeve. I trim just enough off the bottom of the sleeve so the bias band can be folded under, and again, this will be hand sewn into place later on using those machine stitches. So for now, I just pull out that visible gather row and iron the bias band under to the wrong side of the sleeve. And then I gather the top side of the sleeve until it fits that armhole area. And I match up the sleeve ends to the dress as well as the center of the sleeve to the shoulder seam. And then I adjust the gathers from there and the length of the sleeve so it all just fits, you know what I'm trying to say. After sewing the sleeve to the dress, I give the seam allowance a trim so all those edges are tidy, and finally I run a tight zigzag over those raw edges to enclose them. And yes, you could use a serger if you have one set up next to you, and I just like to use a zigzag. Anywho, finally I pin the sleeve bands together, again making sure those ends are still folded. I also make sure that the sleeve seam is facing the sleeve to give it that added poof, if you will, before securing the sides of the dress with French seams. And I have a detailed video on how to do French seams that I will link below. From there, it's a matter of doing whatever hem treatment you prefer. I have a number of videos, whether it's just a hand-sewn hem treatment, whether it's a Madeira hem, a lace treatment, whatever floats your boat. It is sewing, you do you, and then just add whatever your favorite closures is to the back. And of course, those bits of hand sewing need to get done before calling the garment complete. So I hope this video is helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I will do my best to answer them. As always, I appreciate y'all for watching, and I hope to catch y'all next time.